The house had never felt so quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet that settles in after a long day, nor the comforting hush of a familiar routine. This was the kind of silence that echoed, that pressed against the walls and crept into corners, the kind that made footsteps sound like thunder and the creak of old wood like a scream. For Thomas Grady, 61 years old and 3 months a widower, the silence had become unbearable. He sat in his living room, sunlight cutting through the slats of closed blinds, painting harsh lines across the dust that now coated every untouched surface. Maggie had loved this room, had filled it with music and laughter and cinnamon candles that lingered in the air for days after she lit them. Now the only scent was dust and time. 3 months. It still didn't feel real. He kept the house just the way she left it, her favorite blanket still draped over the armchair, her reading glasses perched on top of her latest novel, her slippers tucked neatly beside the bed. Sometimes he imagined she was still here, just in another room, or out in the garden, tending to her hydrangeas. But the truth always came crashing back. She was gone, and he was alone. The suggestion had come from his daughter Emily during one of her routine check-in calls. "Dad," she had said gently, "I know you don't want to talk to a therapist or go to grief counseling, but maybe it would help to have company, something to take care of, something that needs you." "You mean like a plant?" "I mean like a dog." Thomas had scoffed at the time. He hadn't owned a dog since childhood, and that one had been more his father's than his. Besides, dogs were work. They needed attention and patience, and he wasn't sure he had either of those left. But the silence had started to win. 2 weeks later, he stood inside the local shelter, surrounded by barking and whining and the overwhelming smell of antiseptic and fur. A cheerful young woman with a clipboard introduced herself as Lindsay and led him past rows of kennels. Dogs of all shapes and sizes peered out at him, some excited, some terrified, others indifferent. He didn't feel a connection to any of them until they reached the far end of the aisle. This one just came in a few days ago, Lindsay said, pausing in front of a kennel near the back wall. "He's been a challenge." Thomas stepped closer. Inside sat a large German shepherd, lean but strong, with a deep black saddle marking across his back and intelligent amber eyes. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, he didn't move. He just watched Thomas with unsettling stillness. "What's his name?" Thomas asked. "We don't know. He didn't come with tags, and the chip was unregistered. We've been calling him Shadow." "Why?" "Because he follows you like one, silently, cautiously, but he doesn't trust easily. Probably been through something rough." Thomas met the dog's gaze. So had he. They let him into the visiting. Shadow didn't charge at him or leap with joy like some of the other dogs had. He stood in the corner, back stiff, watching. Thomas knelt slowly, resting one hand on his knee, saying nothing, just being there. Minutes passed. Then Shadow took one step forward, then another and another, until he was close enough for Thomas to lift a hand and gently touch his head. For the first time in months, Thomas felt something warm crack open in his chest. He brought Shadow home that night. The dog didn't bark on the drive, didn't pant, didn't stick his head out the window. He simply sat in the back seat, body tense, eyes scanning the world as it passed. At the house, Shadow paced for a long time, room to room, sniffing every corner, tail low. He seemed to recognize the sorrow in the air. Perhaps he'd smelled it before. Thomas laid out a bed for him by the fireplace, filled a bowl with water, and opened a can of food. Shadow ignored it all and curled up tightly against the wall. Neither of them slept much that first night, but for the first time in weeks, Thomas wasn't alone in the silence. The morning came slower than usual. For once, Thomas didn't wake up to the crushing stillness that had haunted his bedroom for the past 3 months. Instead, there was a subtle shift in the air, a presence, not Maggie's, but something new, something alive. Shadow. The German shepherd had not moved much during the night. Thomas had checked on him more than once, half expecting to find the dog gone or having torn the place apart. But no, he simply laid there, quiet, tense, alert, even in sleep. Now, as dawn filtered through the kitchen windows, Thomas found him. Sitting upright by the back door, ears perked. "You want to go out?" he asked, unsure. The dog didn't bark, but he tilted his head slightly, then looked back at the door. "All right," Thomas said and opened it. Shadow stepped out cautiously, nose twitching as he took in the crisp autumn air. The backyard was fenced, Maggie's old garden still half alive. At the edges, but there was plenty of space to roam. Shadow didn't run. He walked a loop, slow and deliberate, sniffing along the perimeter before finally stopping near the hydrangea bush. Thomas watched from the steps. "I know. She used to spend all her time out there," he said quietly. Shadow turned his head toward him, and in that gaze there was understanding. Maybe not of words, but of grief, of absence, of change. Breakfast was another cautious dance. Thomas made scrambled eggs and toast. He set down Shadow's food bowl, this time mixing a bit of warm chicken broth into the kibble, hoping it would tempt him. Shadow sniffed the bowl, took a tentative bite, then devoured the rest. Progress. Afterward, the dog followed him around the house. Not close, but never far behind either. Thomas talked to him like he was human. "You can sit wherever you want. Couch is open." Shadow didn't move from his spot by the door. "I used to hate the quiet, you know. When Maggie was gone, it was like this house just died with her." Faint chuff, not a bark, not even a growl, just a sound of acknowledgement. Thomas smiled, surprised at himself. That afternoon, they walked. It had been years since Thomas had taken a real walk. After Maggie's diagnosis, his life had revolved around doctor visits, hospital trips, and long nights by her side. And after her passing, the idea of walking around the neighborhood alone seemed unbearable. But now, leash in hand, Shadow by his side, Thomas stepped out of his front door and into the world. The breeze was cool, the sky a high blue bowl above them. Fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet. Shadow stayed close but alert, constantly watching, constantly reading the world around him. Thomas couldn't help but admire the discipline in the dog's movements, each step precise, controlled, like a soldier. They passed a mother pushing a stroller, a jogger, a boy riding his bike. People gave Shadow a wide berth. He was a large dog after all, but a few offered cautious smiles. "Beautiful shepherd," one man said. Thomas nodded. "Yeah, he's something." They circled the block, and when they returned to the house, Shadow walked in on his own and laid down by the fireplace without a word. Thomas stared for a long time. He hadn't spoken to that many people in one day, since the funeral. That night, a storm rolled in. The first rumble of thunder shook the house. Thomas looked up from his chair. Shadow was no longer at the fireplace. A soft whine came from the hallway. He found the dog hiding in the bathroom, curled, behind the toilet, body trembling. "Hey," Thomas said gently, crouching down. "It's just thunder." But Shadow wasn't listening. His eyes were wide, wild, panicked. It hit Thomas like a punch. The dog had seen something terrible, not just been abandoned, but traumatized. Okay, you're all right," he said, staying low. "You're safe here." It took almost an hour before Shadow came out, slowly, hesitantly, and laid beside the couch. Thomas sat on the floor, close but not too close, and talked softly until the thunder faded. He didn't know who had hurt this dog or what he'd endured, but he recognized the signs. He saw it in the way Shadow flinched at sudden noises, the way he never turned his back, the way he rarely closed both eyes at once. Shadow was broken too. Just like him, in the days that followed, their rhythm began to form. Mornings started with coffee for Thomas and a backyard patrol for Shadow. Walks around the neighborhood became part of their routine. People began to recognize them. The old man and the silent shepherd. Some even stopped to chat. Rescue, they'd ask. Yes, Thomas would say, but I think he rescued me. One afternoon they passed a group of children playing in a front yard. A bull rolled toward the sidewalk. One of the boys chased after it and froze when he saw Shadow. The dog froze too, body tense. Thomas tightened his grip on the leash just in case. But then, something unexpected. Shadow looked at the child, then sat. The boy retrieved his ball. "Your dog's cool," he said. Thomas nodded. "Yeah, he is." That night, Shadow slept near the bed. A week after adopting him, Thomas took Shadow to the vet. The doctor scanned for a chip again, still unregistered, but there were old scars beneath the fur. Faint, linear, like surgical marks or something. Worse. He'd also had a fractured rib that had healed incorrectly. "He's been through hell," the vet said. "Can you guess how old?" 4, maybe 5. Still strong, but there's history there. "War?" Thomas asked. "Maybe. Could be military, could be something less official." Thomas looked at the dog, who sat still and obedient on the exam room floor, eyes tracking every movement. "Wherever he came from," the vet said, "he was trained, and he survived." That night, as Thomas sat with Shadow on the porch, he ran, a hand along the dog's back, and said, "I don't know what you went through, buddy, but I think we're supposed to help each other." Shadow leaned into his hand. For the first time since Maggie died, Thomas felt like the house was starting to breathe again. That maybe, just maybe, life hadn't ended, just changed. There were still bad days, still quiet nights that pressed too close, still photos he couldn't look at without tears, but now there were also soft sighs from a sleeping dog. Warm fur beneath his hand, long walks with strangers who became neighbors. Shadow didn't fix the silence, but he filled it, and for Thomas, that was enough. The trees had begun to shed their golden leaves, blanketing the ground in soft amber. Each morning, the crunch beneath. Thomas's boots reminded him of how the seasons moved on, even if he hadn't, but this time he wasn't walking alone. Shadow trotted beside him, tail neutral, alert but at ease. It had been nearly 2 weeks since they'd found each other, 2 weeks of tentative routines, quiet companionship, and slow mutual repair. The bond forming between them wasn't flashy or dramatic, it was steady, like something forged in fire. Today's walk led them farther than usual, past the post office, past the bakery, where the girl with the red curls always waved at Shadow, and toward the park. Maggie had loved this park. They used to bring a picnic blanket and books. Sometimes they wouldn't talk for hours, just listen to the wind and watch the geese. Thomas had avoided it since she passed, but now he felt drawn. "Let's try it," he said to Shadow, turning the corner. The moment they stepped onto the gravel trail, Shadow froze. His ears flattened. "What is it?" Thomas asked, immediately alert. The dog's hackles didn't rise, and he didn't growl, just stood still, eyes locked ahead. Thomas followed his gaze and saw a man tossing a tennis ball for his Labrador across the grass. Nothing threatening. "You all right, buddy?" Thomas asked, kneeling to scratch behind Shadow's ear. The dog finally relaxed and moved forward. Something about the open space must have reminded him of something. A deployment, a base. Whatever it was, he pushed through it, just like Thomas had when he walked into the park again for the first time. Together they sat at Maggie's favorite bench. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small leather journal she'd given him on their 10th anniversary. The pages were filled with notes, poems, and thoughts scribbled in her elegant handwriting. Shadow rested his chin on Thomas's boot. Thomas opened to a random page. "Even after I'm gone, I want you to sit on our bench and let the wind find you. I'll be there in the rustle of the trees, in the warmth of the sun." His eyes stung. Shadow whimpered softly and nudged Thomas's knee. He looked down. "You feel her too, huh?" The dog's amber eyes met his. Back home, something unexpected happened. Thomas fell asleep on the couch, something he rarely did anymore. And when he woke up to the low hum of the television and the scent of rain, Shadow was curled on the floor nearby, his body twitching, breath quick and shallow. A nightmare. Shadow, Thomas said softly, reaching out. The dog jerked awake, eyes wild. For a moment, Thomas saw the panic again, the old ghosts haunting him from whatever past he couldn't explain. "You're safe," Thomas said calmly. "You're home." Shadow blinked, ears relaxing. Thomas didn't know what memories clawed at him when he slept, but they were real, just like his own nightmares. Later that week, they went to a local veterans event. Thomas hadn't planned to attend, but a neighbor invited him, and he figured it would be a good exposure trip for Shadow. The field was full of booths, flags, families, and laughter. Shadow walked close, eyes always moving. Then it happened. Man in a wheelchair rolled by, his military cap embroidered with an insignia Thomas recognized. Shadow froze. Then he approached the man slowly. The veteran stopped. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "Where'd you get this guy?" Thomas walked up. "Adopted him. A rescue. Why? That's a unit dog. I'd bet my life on it. Look at the stance, the discipline. That's not backyard training, that's elite." Shadow was now sitting, eyes fixed on the veteran. "What's his name?" "Shadow," Thomas replied. The man smiled. "Fitting. Mine was named Rook. You'd be amazed how many dogs we lost out there. The lucky ones came home. Some got left behind. Sometimes they were retired and handed off to civilian shelters with no ID, no records, just ghosts." Thomas felt a chill. "I think he remembers something," he said. "He remembers everything," the man replied. "They always do that." Night. Thomas opened his laptop and searched. He dug through forums, military canine unit records, and abandoned dog reports. He couldn't find Shadow's exact origin, but he found dozens of similar cases. Dogs returned without handlers. Handlers killed, units disbanded. Bureaucracy chewing through loyalty like old meat. What mattered more than finding a name, though, was giving Shadow a new one, a real home. In the weeks that followed, Thomas and Shadow became fixtures in the community. The coffee shop on 6th kept a biscuit behind the counter just for Shadow. Kids waved to him from their school buses. The reclusive man, who never spoke more than a grunt, now asked how Shadow was doing. Thomas even began volunteering at the animal shelter once a week. One morning, the director, Elaine, pulled him aside. "I've seen a lot of men walk in here with ghosts behind their eyes," she said. "You were one of them," he chuckled dryly. "Still am most days. You're different now, lighter. It's the dog, isn't it?" He looked across the yard at Shadow, who was gently herding 3 puppies away from a broken fence post. "Yeah," he said. "He saved me." Elaine nodded. "Funny thing is, I think you saved him too." One evening, just before winter came in full, Thomas and Shadow walked the long trail behind Maggie's old church. Snow began to fall gently around them, soft as ash. Thomas looked up at the sky. Then he looked at Shadow. "You know, I used to think my life ended when she died." The dog turned, sitting calmly, waiting. "But I think she sent you. You weren't a replacement. You were a bridge." Shadow walked up and rested his head against Thomas's leg. Thomas knelt down and whispered, "We're gonna be okay, both of us." The dog licked his cheek once, gentle, reverent, and for the first time in a long, long time, Thomas believed it. The wind howled outside the cabin windows, dragging leaves across the porch like whispers. Inside, Thomas sat near the fireplace, its gentle crackle warming both the room and the silence. Shadow lay stretched out by the hearth, eyes half closed, but always listening. They'd been through 4 months of seasons together now, and in that time, the bond between man and dog had deepened in ways Thomas never could have predicted. But healing wasn't a straight path. Grief didn't operate on a schedule. That evening, something arrived in the mail that stirred old wounds. A yellowed envelope, no return address, with only Thomas's name written in tight block letters. Inside was a single photograph, creased at the corners. It was from Afghanistan, and in the center of the photo stood a handler with a German shepherd, lean, alert, and unmistakably familiar. Shadow. Thomas stared at it, throat tightening. The handler was young, with sandy blonde hair and a half-smile. His hand rested on Shadow's head like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. Thomas turned the photo over. A date was scrawled in ink, October 14th, 2016, Forward Operating Base Hunter. No note, no explanation, just a memory that wasn't his. He looked at Shadow. The dog had lifted his head, eyes on the photo. "You know him," Thomas whispered. Shadow padded over, sniffed the photo once, then lay down again, ears flat. A low whimper escaped him. That night, Shadow didn't sleep by the fire. He sat near the door, alert and unmoving. The next morning, Thomas called the only man he knew who might have answers. Colonel Denton, a retired officer who lived in a nearby town. Thomas had met him at a veterans group just a month ago. When he explained the photo, Denton's tone grew grave. "You need to come by," the colonel said. "Bring the dog." An hour later, Thomas and Shadow were in the colonel's study, a wall lined with medals and fading photographs. Denton took one look at the photo and sighed. "I knew him." "Knew who?" "The handler, Sergeant Kyle Mercer. One of the best K9 teams we ever had. Shadow was his partner." Thomas blinked. His name really was Shadow? It was Shadow back then too. That dog saved more lives than I can count. But they were separated after an IED blast killed Mercer. Shadow survived, but protocol sent him back to the US quietly. No medals, no retirement ceremony, just discarded. Thomas looked down at Shadow, who sat silently, eyes dim with memory. "Why would someone send me this now?" The colonel handed the photo back. "Maybe someone thought you deserved to know the truth. Or maybe they thought he deserved to be remembered." Over the next few days, Thomas wrestled with a growing sense of duty. Shadow had a past, a name, a partner who died with no ceremony, no farewell. Maybe part of healing meant honoring that. So Thomas made a plan. They'd visit Kyle Mercer's hometown. Say the goodbye that Shadow never got to give. The town was small, only 2 hours north. A dot on the map called Alder Hollow. The leaves had turned fire red when Thomas and Shadow arrived. They found the grave easily. Sergeant Kyle Mercer, 1988-2016. He gave his all. There were a few small flags left at the headstone. A faded collar sat nearby, possibly from someone who remembered Shadow. Thomas knelt. Shadow didn't move. He just stared. Then quietly, he let out a soft, broken sound. It wasn't a whine or bark. It was grief. Real, deep, bone-level grief. Thomas placed the photo at the foot of the grave and whispered, "He's not alone anymore." They stayed until dusk. As they left, a woman approached, grey sweater, eyes rimmed with tears. "You knew Kyle?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I knew of him. But he was Shadow's first partner. I adopted him months ago. I thought it was time to visit." The woman knelt before Shadow, touching his head gently. "He talked about you in his last letter. Called you his best friend." Thomas's throat clenched. He always said if anything happened, he hoped you'd find someone who could love you like he did. Back home, winter finally came. Snow blanketed the world outside in silence. Inside, warmth returned to places that had long gone cold. Thomas began volunteering more, first with veterans, then with dogs. Shadow became something of a local legend, a story of survival, of loyalty, of second chances. One evening, Thomas was invited to speak at a veterans gala. He brought Shadow with him. When he stepped to the microphone, he looked out at the sea. of faces and said, "I lost my wife, I lost myself, but I found him. Or maybe he found me." Shadow isn't just a dog, he's a survivor, a soldier, a reminder that healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means carrying the memory forward. The room was silent. Then one by one, they stood, a standing ovation, not for Thomas, but for the dog at his side. That night, Thomas lit a candle on Maggie's bench. He held up a small wooden plaque engraved with Shadow's name and a simple phrase, "Once a soldier, always family." Shadow lay beside him, calm and content, and Thomas finally understood. Love didn't die. It just changed form. And sometimes healing came on four legs, wearing scars of its own.